Zack Telander recently had to make another video defending deadlifts because his original video where he went over Oberst's claims about the risk to reward ratio on them is starting to go viral again. His video was met with a lot of comments demonizing deadlifts, so I'm going to actually add some extra thoughts and insights to the comments that he highlighted. The first comment that I'm going to highlight says that deadlifts are just more dangerous than other exercise options, and that's a fact. Well, to start, no, that's not a fact. And actually, there isn't much evidence on injury rates for specific exercises, but when looking at all exercises in general, the injury rates are quite low. So saying that a certain exercise is quite dangerous is a pretty moot point because the overall risk is very low in general. But I'll humor it and go over the injury rates. So when looking at powerlifting, the overall injury rate for 1,000 hours of participation is about 1 to 4.4, with the average in evidence kind of showing it to be more around 4. So this is quite low overall, and to put it into perspective, running has an injury rate of about 7.7 to 17.8 injuries per 1,000 participation hours, and this can go up to 59 if you're looking at marathon running. So you shouldn't run unless you're running for running's sake, because the risk to reward ratio is just too great, isn't it? And if you're looking at soccer or football for my non-North American viewers, then the match injury rates are around 17 to 36, depending on what level of soccer you're looking at. And to add in that the injury rate for all of lifting is pretty low, the numbers for Olympic-style weightlifting and CrossFit are around 3.2 and 4 injuries per 1,000 hours of participation. Again, that is extremely low when looking at all injury rates. And on top of that, the most common injured area in powerlifting, for example, because deadlift is one of the main movements in it, is the shoulder. And that is mostly caused by the bench press. Now, the bench press is used a lot in the training for football. I'm talking about American football here now. And it is not only just used in training, but is also used as a test in the combine. And it is a marker for the strength of all the athletes. So since that movement may have the highest injury rate in terms of all of the powerlifting movements, athletes shouldn't be doing bench press unless they're bench pressing to increase bench press, because the risk to reward ratio is just too great, right? It's almost like any movement can have a risk of injury, and it's not about the movement itself because all exercises are made up. It's more about how prepared that athlete is to do that movement, how the programming is around that movement, and what their capacity is for that movement at the time. And that idea is partially supported by a paper that looked at injuries in strongman events, and they found that the majority of the injuries occurred at around 90% or higher of their 1RM. In other words, this means it happened when the athletes were pushing their bodies to the limits. And whenever you push your body to the limit, there is an increased risk of injury. That is just something that you have to accept. So in terms of training, you don't want to push your body to the limit on the lifts because you're training to support your athletic endeavors in your sport. So you should never really be training any of the lifts to increase the lifts for their sake as an athlete. You should be training using the lifts in order to get some specified outcome from them that helps you with your sport. So again, saying that these movements are dangerous is dumb because they should be used within their capacity to allow for better performance in the sport. If there are more injuries popping up with these movements, it means that the programming around them is bad. And if the coach is programming them, that coach is just doing a terrible job. And it gets even more gray when you think about what a deadlift really is. Zack did a great job of breaking that down, so I'm going to play that here.
A type of lift where the weight or barbell is lifted off the ground until the lifter is standing up straight. But can we say that the deadlift is picking something up? So you're standing, you bend over, you pick something up, and you stand back up.
So if a deadlift is just picking something up off of the ground, when does it become injurious? Would an empty barbell be injurious? Would a 100-pound deadlift be injurious? What about the capacity of the athlete? Why does the mythical risk to reward ratio only apply to exercises and not the capacity of the athlete and the relative weight that they're using? What if a person has to pick up a 25 kilogram case of water? That's about the standard 24 pack of water here. What if their max deadlift is 25 kilos? What if it's 300 kilos? Who has the lower risk of injury, and why is it the person with 300 kilo deadlift? Could it be that they have a higher capacity to lift something up off of the ground and a 25 kilo case of water is a much lower percentage of their max? That would be backed up by the paper I just talked about. Zack also does a really good example of explaining this and gets you to think through it. He does it later in his video, but I'm going to put it in here to really hammer the point home.
My definition of a deadlift, let's just say it's pick something up off the ground. Okay, my backpack is on the ground. And I say, well, I'm not allowed to deadlift, but can I pick that up? And the guy goes, yes, don't be an asshole. So I can pick up my backpack. Can I pick it up 20 times? Pick it up and put it down 20 times? Sure. Okay. I go, okay, well, can I put a 5-pound plate in there? Can I put 10-pound plate in there? 20, 30, 40. Okay, what's the line? Where am I not allowed to pick something up off the floor? And then the person is most likely going to say, at the weight that you are not capable of. Boom. Right there, that is the case with every other movement.
Again, this all points to how capacity is a bigger factor for injury risk, and it's not the movement itself. There's a reason that I can go and rip Zercher deadlifts at the weight I do and not get injured, because I've built up the capacity to do them over time and my body is used to them. If I were to just walk in on day one and try to lift the weight I do now, I probably would have gotten injured because that's above my capacity. That doesn't mean that the movement is bad, it just means that my body isn't prepared for that movement. And this should add to the argument that an absolute statement about a movement's injury risk is stupid because it doesn't take progressive overload into consideration, it doesn't take capacity into consideration, it doesn't take the body's ability to adapt into consideration. It just looks at the movement as a movement itself and forgets all of these other factors related to programming. And programming is a very important part. If these lifts are done within the athlete's capacity, they're completely safe. With any lift, if you just let an athlete go in and try to max out every time, they're bound to get injured at some point because they're going to be working above their capacity. That's just stupid programming. It's not about the movements themselves. So it is actually not a fact that deadlifts are dangerous, and it is more a reflection of the capacity of the athlete to do that movement and the preparedness of the athlete to do that movement, as well as the programming around that movement. Even if you want to believe something to be true, it doesn't make it true, especially when there isn't evidence to support it and there is evidence that can actually kind of go against it. Okay, the next comment is, anyone saying deadlifts are low risk should do them 7 days a week for a year. Well, if you take the definition that we used earlier in this video, I already do this. I have been doing this for multiple years when I lift myself and as well as programming for my patients and clients. I am demonstrating deadlifts all of the time. I am lifting up barbells. I am lifting up kettlebells. I am lifting up dumbbells. I am constantly picking something up off of the ground to a standing position, aka a deadlift. I have no problem with this, and it doesn't injure me because those deadlifts are well within my capacity, so I can easily do them 7 days a week for a whole year and more. And this is just reinforcing the point that Zack made where he said the weight you use relative to the capacity you have is what matters on this. I don't think he said it exactly like that, but that was the gist of his argument. Now, I understand this person is talking about doing working weights and working sets with these deadlifts. So taking your regular deadlift workout and then just multiplying that by 7. One, this is absolutely idiotic programming. If you were to do that, yes, you could potentially have an increased risk in injury. But that goes for every single exercise because that is just absolutely awful programming. If your body only has capacity for the work you're doing now, let's say you deadlift twice a week, and you do 3 hard sets each workout, if you now multiply that and do it 7 days of the week, you're going to be working well over your capacity if you're doing the same weights every single day. That is terrible programming, and it applies to every single exercise. I don't see how this comment doesn't understand that, and the absolute idiocy behind it is actually baffling, right? So the same thing can be said for squats, it can be said for bench press, it can be said for curls, it can be said for tricep press downs. You could do the same thing with a machine chest press, any machine movement. You know, if you're trying to be like, I'm extra stable and safe because I'm working in a machine. No. It's the programming that matters, it's not the movement. Ironically, comments like this show an insane lack of critical thinking, but they're so close to the actual point. They're pointing out that the programming is stupid this way, but they aren't seeing that it can apply to every single exercise. These comments are just mindlessly repeating things that they have heard from other people or from other influencers. Like a parrot, they fearmonger and demonize certain movements, but they don't critically think about all the aspects that go into that comment and go into that process. So they're missing out on what actually matters. Again, it's the programming and capacity and not the movement. Next, there's another comment that is pretty close to getting it and actually touches on some parts of the argument as well from this lovely sports scientist. Zack already did a great job of saying how heavy should still be within the athlete's capacity. And if it's outside of the athlete's capacity, then again, that's terrible programming. And it's either if the athlete is doing the programming themselves, it's on them, or it's on their coach/trainer. The commenter even touches on the point that it's heavyweight for the individual, which reflects that he is acknowledging that the capacity of the athlete and the weight relative to that is what matters. So they understand that it might not necessarily be the movement itself, but it is the weight and the programming around it, which is what Zack and myself are getting at. Also, the last part about what he sees as injuries, anecdotes don't really mean all that much in terms of science. And myself personally, I see way more injuries with shoulders and bench press. But again, that's biased because of the populations I work with. So your bad anecdote can be refuted with another bad anecdote. It doesn't really matter, and you have to look at the broader aspect of science and the broader aspect of the evidence if you want to make an argument. By adding that on and you saying you're a sports scientist, you're just trying to bolster your argument by using the fallacy of authority when really it doesn't actually hold any weight. Now, aside from the comments, I want to talk about back injuries in general because there is a problem with how they're viewed. Most of the injuries with lifting are muscle strains, and that happens very commonly. Now, muscle strains in the back are just catastrophized and blown way out of proportion. And in the health and fitness industry, this is actually preyed upon, which feeds back into the catastrophization of these back muscle strains. A muscle strain to your erectors is the same as a muscle strain to your quads. But when someone strains their quads doing a squat or a leg extension, they don't freak out because they understand that it's a quad muscle and that it is strained and that it will get better over time. However, when it comes to the back, any pain there is demonized. And like I said, it's preyed upon in the fitness industry and the health industry so that people can make money off of these injuries and make money off of having you to avoid pain at all costs. So when you strain a muscle in your back, it doesn't mean that everything's over. It doesn't mean that you're never going to be able to lift again. And it doesn't mean that the movement is bad. It just means that you weren't quite prepared for it and you went a little bit above your capacity. The exact same as if you did that with your quad on a leg extension. That muscle strain will get better, and with time, your strength will come back as long as you continue to train it. It doesn't mean that you have to avoid it. In fact, it means that you might have to train it more so that it becomes more resilient. This is the harm that can be done with demonizing certain movements. They get people scared to train certain parts of their body, and as a result, they actually get weaker there and become more vulnerable there. Okay, hard transition back to the comments. This one's talking about showing a top paid athlete doing deadlifts. Well, there are plenty of videos of top paid athletes doing deadlifts and deadlift adjacent activities. Again, if we consider just picking something up off of the ground as a deadlift, there's countless videos of that. Here's a D1 football player doing cleans with 380 pounds. So calling back to the start of the video, Olympic lifts have a very similar injury rate to powerlifting. So why are these not demonized, and why is the risk to reward ratio not that bad with them? It's almost like these athletes do these movements more so they're more prepared with them and they understand them better, even though football athletes still do deadlifts. Here's a couple examples of football players doing trap bar deadlifts. And Zack Telander already showed the video of JJ Watts doing the tire flip, which again involves a deadlift. There's even videos of soccer players doing deadlifts of different variations, from landmine deadlifts to straight bar deadlifts, and I could keep searching and find some more trap bar deadlifts, but honestly, I've already made enough points and found enough videos. These deadlifts are done well within the athlete's capacity and they aren't maxing out on it because they don't have to. This just shows that these movements are used and they do have their utility for these top paid athletes. And they aren't maxing out on it, not because it's dangerous, but because they don't have to. Because that wouldn't have the most utility in their training and give them the most benefit in their sport compared to doing other movements. Just because your bias is that they don't do it doesn't mean that is right. You either don't search for it and therefore as a result only consume things that confirm your bias, or you just don't consume all that much training footage in general, so you just stay blissfully ignorant and repeat what you hear from other people. Maybe you like to live in ignorance without checking to see if the statements you're making are correct or the statements that you're hearing are correct without actually going and searching out the source information or trying to challenge your own biases. I understand that can be a nice and simple life, and I get it. Having your biases challenged is difficult and it does require some reflection on yourself. It can be hard to do. There are also a lot more sports than the ones mentioned, and that plays a big role. So deadlifts, and more specifically Zercher deadlifts, are used a lot more in things like wrestling, MMA, and other combat sports because those athletes have to literally pick other human beings off of the ground and throw them. So those exercises have a lot of utility and a lot of transfer over to their sport, so they're going to use them. And this brings me to my next point, which is what I was getting at when I was talking about these soccer players. An athlete's training is done to enhance their performance in sport, so exercise selection is going to reflect that. So these intended outcomes with training matter for exercise selection. If you don't need a lot of top-end broad back strength for your sport, then you're not going to spend a lot of time training for it. You're going to save that time and energy to do other things. Now, training doesn't have a massive translation over to sport, so sport-specific training is blown out of the water and its utility is very limited. This means that trying to mimic your sport movements with your training isn't the best idea. But the qualities that can be developed from movements like power and strength and speed do have a larger translation over to sport, and those are what should be focused on. So to kind of give some examples on this, if your sport doesn't require a lot of top and raw strength, you're not going to spend that much time training it. But you're not going to spend no time training it either, because top end raw strength does result in some extra power. It is a component of it. But these top end athletes are going to find the balance of that, and they're going to spend a lot less time doing the strength training and a lot more time doing the power training. Athletes only have so much time, energy, and capacity, so they can't do every single exercise. They have to be strategic with their training and do movements that are going to give them the highest return for their sport. So if an exercise doesn't have a lot of return for their sport, let's say a soccer player doing max deadlifts, then they're not going to do it that often because they're going to be wasting their energy and it's going to take away from their other training. This is just basic knowledge for programming. It has nothing to do with injury risk and everything to do with what is going to give the highest return for that player. So pointing out all these different sports and saying, oh, these top athletes don't do this exercise may not be the best argument, because that exercise might not have the most utility in their training. Athletes aren't training to do certain exercises, they're training to get better at their sport. And sometimes those exercises can take a little bit more time and energy than is worth the squeeze that they get from it. But I guarantee that these athletes still do some of those exercises. For example, a football player is going to deadlift. They're probably going to do clean pulls as well above what they can power clean, because that will help their clean. They're just going to spend less time doing those deadlifts and less time doing those clean pulls because they're going to be getting more out of the actual power clean itself. This doesn't mean that the exercise is dangerous. It just means that they're training to enhance their sport, and that utility is what is making the exercise selection. So this argument isn't the best argument, and it's a little bit of a straw man. Exercises are just tools to train certain muscles and outputs. They aren't inherently dangerous, and they should be used like those tools and not demonized. I hope this video got one person to open their mind a little bit and stop parodying the bad advice that they hear. Thank you for watching. Now go out there, do some deadlifts, and make some gains.